History. When we're told American history, we hear a tale of pilgrims and pioneers, founding fathers and famous men. History highlights wars and statesmen, explorers and inventors, politicians and soldiers. It's a story of power, of those who sought it, those who got it, and how they wielded it. But there's another history. It's sometimes alluded to, but rarely told. It is the story of the wellspring of American power, from whence it came. There are men who are more responsible in many ways than presidents and politicians, statesmen and soldiers, for what we are and where we are. This is a story of those who were spurred to develop our every resource. A story of what motivated them to do what they did. Some call it greed.
In 1917, the United States entered the scene as a major world power with that April 6th declaration of war on Germany. We were a nation of 103 million, more rural than urban, more agricultural than industrial. Until then, we had been isolated from big power politics and diplomacy. We entered the war at an exceedingly critical time. Germany had been fighting the combined power of the Allies, Britain, France, Russia, and Italy, and Germany was winning the war. What made Germany so formidable was not her legendary militarism. What made this militarism so awesome was the productive power behind it. Germany was the most industrialized country in Europe, despite the nationalism of France. The pageantry of Tsarist Russia, the glory and grandeur of the great British Empire. Germany had more of the means with which to fight. Fortunately for the Allies, the United States had even greater industrial muscle. Our steel industry was the largest in the world, turning out more tonnage than Germany, France, and Great Britain combined. Our coal mines powered our prodigious industrial machine, while a new source of energy, oil, fueled the engines of the latest instruments of war: trucks, tanks, and airplanes. Our railroads carried 3 million tons of freight a day over more than 250,000 miles of track. We produced in quantity coal, steel, guns, and ships. We also produced what Germany could not: food. The American farmer was the most productive in the world. With American power, the Allies won that war. What was it that made us so strong? Why were we more powerful than France, Russia, Britain, and Germany?
Incentive. More people had the chance to get ahead, to succeed, and to be richly rewarded. It was the outcome of what some call greed. The heavy industries of those years, the industries from which our strength derived, were built by men history has branded robber barons. In business, they were hard, ruthless, and unscrupulous. They loved money. Ostentatious and extravagant, they built mansions and called them cottages.
The stars all shine for everyone. They're shining for you.
Their excesses, their shortcomings, these are well known. But their achievements? These men did not see themselves as robber barons. They saw themselves as creators of great enterprises, as mighty builders. For every dollar they spent on cottages, they invested hundreds more in steel, transportation, food, and oil.
J.P. Morgan made capital available for the industrial giants of decades ago. Capital, of course, is the lifeblood of every industry and business. In a way, it's like food. Without it, the economy cannot grow. To feed the spectacular expansion of the U.S. economy, financial resources were mobilized from home and abroad by J.P. Morgan. Andrew Carnegie almost single-handedly developed the American steel industry in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Steel, the industrial backbone of the nation in that period. Steel for railroads, steel for buildings, steel for machines. John D. Rockefeller relentlessly organized the oil industry, tying together the discovery, transportation, refining, and marketing of petroleum. This made possible a seemingly endless supply of cheap energy. Gustavus Swift, he developed the refrigerated railroad car and centralized the meat packing process. For the first time, the average American could afford to put meat on the table each and every day.
Greed. It gave the robber barons these. And it gave America the most productive economy in the world. It won a war and set the stage for an industry that would change the shape of America. We would go from an economy dominated by farming and heavy industry to the economy of the consumer, to the society we know today. The work week would be reduced from 60 hours or more to 40 hours. Real wages would increase tenfold. The catalyst for this extraordinary change was the automobile.
The man who gave us the auto as we know it today was Henry Ford. He turned a toy for the rich, something which cost the equivalent of $50,000 today, into something every man could afford. In the early 1900s, Ford experimented with model after model, beginning with the letter A. Finally, he developed what he wanted, a sturdy, practical car, the Model T. Now he faced the seemingly impossible task of producing this car at a cost everyone could afford. In 1913, Ford found a solution. The continuously moving assembly line. At a meatpacking plant, he had been impressed with the way a beef carcass was moved down a line and quickly, efficiently disassembled. Ford simply and brilliantly reversed the process. In doing so, he initiated modern mass production. He showed how something immensely complicated with hundreds of individual parts could be manufactured as quickly and efficiently as nails or needles.
Ford's success did not come easily. Earlier in his career, he had twice been hired to design and build cars for others. Henry Ford wanted to own his own business. He wanted to reap the rewards of his labor. Only when that was possible did he single-mindedly pursue his idea of a car for the common man.
The efficiency of the assembly line led Ford to his second great innovation, the $5 a day minimum wage.
When he announced his $5 a day policy, the American worker was lucky to earn half that. Businessmen and commentators labeled Ford a fool. They said he would ruin his company with such extravagance. But Ford saw something they did not. He could find methods of manufacturing that would make high wages possible. Ford could see a direct relationship between the wages of working people and the number of cars he could sell. By cutting production costs through the assembly line, he produced cars for less. By paying higher wages, he created more customers. This seemingly simple insight made possible the consumer society.
Many businessmen belittled Ford's innovations, but a far-sighted few saw the potential for profit. One was Frederick Maytag. He concluded that the washboard was all washed up, now that the working man had pocket money, which his wife could coax or wheedle from him.
The skeptics did not think husbands would spend money to free their wives from the back-breaking chores of running the home. A popular joke of the day had an indignant farmer tell an appliance salesman, "My wife ain't wore out yet." But the skeptics, including the farmer, were wrong.
Labor-saving devices quickly became a necessity for the new, growing middle class. Appliances were substitutes for the help we had at home, helping to free the American housewife from much of the drudgery of her daily routine. But the automobile was more than a model for the manufacture of other goods. It changed the way of life. Until the auto, working Americans lived within a short distance of the streetcar or subway that took them to their jobs. All shopping, all entertainment and social life was confined to the area that could be walked to, bicycled to, or ridden to by horse or public transport. But now they had mobility. They were tourists. On Sunday after church, they went for a drive. They were Sunday drivers. Instead of sitting in the swing on the front porch, the young discovered the back seat and lovers' lanes. And in the years ahead, more and more working people would leave the city for the suburbs. The car's proliferation led to the greatest road building program since the Roman Empire. It gave rise to new industries, and it changed others. The auto became the largest consumer of lead, nickel, steel, and rubber. And oil began replacing coal as our chief source of energy. Trucking became a competitor with railroads for freight. Before the car, rural Americans bought many of their goods from catalogs. Now they could drive to the store. With a sharp eye for profit, Sears embarked on an ambitious store-building program, and eventually it became America's largest retailer.
Henry Ford not only started a revolution with his car, he also dominated the industry, selling more cars than all the other manufacturers combined in a market that seemed saturated with all the cars it could afford. No competitor, it seemed, could touch him. But one would try.
Alfred P. Sloan came to General Motors when it was on the verge of bankruptcy. Unable to compete with Ford's Model T prices, Sloan introduced an entirely new concept, installment credit, and it was an instant success. Further, Sloan realized that people regarded the car as something more than bare-bones transportation. So GM offered cars in a range of prices, a variety of styles, and a choice of colors. Most important of all, Sloan introduced the annual model change, which created a sense of excitement and novelty each year. By inducing a customer to buy a new car before his old one was actually worn out, it revolutionized the selling of cars and everything else made for consumers. Sloan also realized that big manufacturing enterprises had grown too complex for any one man to run. Using elaborate charts, he broke down the decision-making process, systematically dividing responsibility. Today, practically every major corporation is run on Sloan's system of management. In 1958, Sloan discussed the era of the one-man corporation and why it ended.
The proprietors and their partners was to largely a selfish one. They looked upon themselves as pioneers, and they expected a bigger reward. Now, as time passed, the whole picture changed. Enterprises got so big, required such tremendous aggregations of capital, it was impossible for any individual and a few partners to manage such an enterprise.
Meanwhile, Henry Ford was still running his company like a patriarch. After 1908, he refused to alter the Model T or to offer it in any color but black. Nor would he sell his cars on credit. By 1927, GM surpassed Ford in sales and profits. It's been that way ever since. Alfred Sloan did not compete with Ford head-on. He simply changed the rules of the game.
It was not only manufacturing which could profit from mass production. Men like Louis B. Mayer, Adolph Zukor, realized that entertainment, once a sideshow, could be big business. So they organized studios, organized them just as though they were assembly lines, and they turned out endless variations on a half a dozen tried and true themes. Hollywood became the center of one of the largest industries in the world, as up to 80 million Americans went to see their favorite stars in a new movie each week. Movies were not the only medium to entertain Americans in the 20s. There was radio, and the preeminent figure behind this novelty, David Sarnoff, who pushed its technical and commercial development, making it available to almost everyone.
The Fleischmann's Geese Hour. Hi-ho, everybody. This is Rudy Valley and Company.
With personalities promoting products, advertising as well as entertainment reached millions live right in their homes. Together, high wages, modern manufacturing methods, installment credit, and advertising created something new in America, the mass market. Inevitably, the mass market came to the money marketplace of America, Wall Street. During World War I, bond rallies were held across the nation at the behest of Douglas Fairbanks, Charlie Chaplin, and Mary Pickford. Working Americans got their first taste of investing. After the war, men such as Charles Mitchell and Theodore Vail realized that securities could be bought and sold like other goods, so they encouraged the small investor. Soon, millions of Americans filled the role once played by the likes of J.P. Morgan.
As more and more working people began sharing in the nation's prosperity, cracks appeared at its very foundations. The hard-pressed farmer was missing out.
Until the early 1920s, farmers had to set aside large parcels of land to grow forage for their draft animals. But the tractor was rapidly replacing the mule. Millions of acres were being freed for food production. The American farmer was growing too much wheat, too much corn, too many pigs. Overproduction was depressing his market. Then there was the Florida land boom. It began in 1924 and quickly reached frenzied proportions. For land prices, the sky was the limit. But this buy-at-any-price mania couldn't last, and didn't. In 1926, a devastating hurricane finished off the already spluttering boom. But Wall Street still looked good.
As the 20s drew to a close, the buying and selling became more frantic. The stock market was the scene of a speculative orgy. Prices soared far beyond their worth. Few warned of the success, but fewer listened. In October 1929, the bubble burst. Prices plunged. Police had to hold back the anxious crowds. The Great Depression had begun. Business savants tried to reassure the nation. Editor of Forbes magazine, V.C. Forbes.
The Wall Street panic, in my opinion, is over. It had to come. Stock speculation had become crazy. Like an appendix operation, it's a good thing to have it over with. I personally have been buying stocks since the crash set in on Tuesday. Now is the time to buy.
A highly respected economist of the day, Irving Fisher.
This country is fundamentally sound, and the technical situation in the stock market is not going to prevent the great improvement, progressive improvement in our wonderful prosperity.
Famous head of the Bethlehem Steel Corporation, Charles Schwab.
We may have times of depression. We may have times of deflated as of inflated values. But the trend must be always onward and upward for any enterprise in this great republic of ours.
Conditions belied their optimism. President Herbert Hoover.
We are convinced that we have overcome the major financial crisis, a crisis in severity unparalleled in the history of the world, and that with its relaxation, confidence and hope have reappeared in the world.
But President Hoover was wrong. The Depression deepened. Thousands of factories went out of business. Banks failed. Men who had once stood at the pinnacle of power now stood on Wall Street corners selling apples. Not only fortunes and factories were lost to the Depression, but reputations as well. The businessman, a popular hero in the prosperous 20s, became a villain, a figure of hate. Sometimes with reason, sometimes without. To inflate stock values, Dr. F. Donald Costa manipulated the books of the prestigious drug firm McKesson and Robbins. When the crime was uncovered, Costa shot himself. The investigation that followed revealed more misdeeds, leading his lawyer to lament,
"Hardly a crime of recent years has not been laid at the door of the late Donald Costa. Stripped of all its sensationalism."
Sensational indeed was the revelation that Dr. F. Donald Costa, MD and PhD, was an alias for an ex-convict, Philip Musica. Samuel Insull had been a highly respected utilities magnate. But with the Depression, his huge empire collapsed. An embittered public, feeling that it had been duped, demanded that he be punished. While seeking asylum abroad, Insull was taken off a ship and brought home for trial.
The depression was too much for me. I went down with my ship. You will be convinced that although my judgment was bad, I was not dishonest.
The farmer's condition, bad before the crash, became unbearable as drought and dust storms swept across the Midwestern breadbasket states. Thousands were forced from their land. Those not destroyed by the Dust Bowl still suffered from overproduction. In an attempt to restore prices, desperate farmers tried to keep milk off the market.
I can't keep my family and pay my expenses on $1.10 hundred milk, or 2 8 cents a quart. They've driven me out here to do what we're doing.
The struggling farmer, the unemployed factory worker, the once mighty businessman, none could avoid the all-embracing depression.
We are planning within a few days to ask the Congress for legislation to enable the government to undertake public works, thus stimulating directly and indirectly the employment of many others in well-considered projects.
To combat the continuing depression, President Roosevelt seemed willing to try anything, and many new programs were rushed through. But recovery was painfully slow. It appeared that the era of economic growth and opportunity had ended, leading skeptics to conclude that a new age was at hand, an age of scarcity.
While pessimism was the order of the day, there was one observer who believed that the Depression was not permanent. This man wrote,
"The prevailing world depression has blinded us to what's going on under the surface, to the true interpretation of the shape of things. We're suffering not from the rheumatics of old age, but from the painfulness of readjusting between one economic period and another."
The observer was the famed economist John Maynard Keynes. He was right, but the readjustments he spoke of were happening in ways even he would not have recognized at the time. Organized labor gained strength as the Depression wore on. Its growth was feared by businessmen who believed that unions would demand far more than companies could afford and would make the efficient functioning of a factory all but impossible. Too often, fear and resentment led to violence.
The often bloody and futile picket line gave way to the sit-down strike. As public opinion swung behind the unions, the federal government followed, and labor rights were secured. Calling union organizers labor dictators, management swore they would resist. But one by one, they capitulated. In essence, labor was trying to institutionalize the concept behind the $5 a day wage. Give the worker a respectable wage, and he will be a consumer, as well as a producer.
Despite the Depression, the drive to profit, to produce more and earn more, could not be suffocated. Working with American Airlines, the Douglas Aircraft Company designed the first money-making all-passenger airplane, the legendary DC-3. Tripp founded Pan American Airways, and with it, pioneered commercial aviation on a worldwide scale. DuPont Laboratories discovered substitutes for two scarce natural resources, rubber and silk. A synthetic replacement for natural rubber, neoprene, was developed under the direction of Dr. Wallace Carruthers. Nylon, another result of Carruthers' research, was first seen as an alternative to the silk harvested from the Japanese silkworm, but it had a far greater range of uses. Even in the most hard-hit sector of our economy, agriculture, ambitious entrepreneurs continued to look for new ways to increase productivity and profits. George Washington Carver experimented with new ways to grow and use peanuts. His discoveries made peanuts the fifth largest crop in the country. Tom Roberts of the DeKalb Association developed hybrid seed, which greatly increased the quality and yield of corn.
As America slowly recovered from its catastrophic depression, Hitler plunged the world into the bloodiest war in history. Japan forced America's hand with the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
On Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Many people have been astonished that Japan should in a single day have plunged into war against the United States and the British Empire. They have certainly embarked upon a very considerable undertaking. What kind of a people do they think we are? Is it possible they do not realize that we shall never cease to persevere against them until they have been taught a lesson which they and the world will never forget?
Brave words, but was Churchill's confidence warranted? Our fleet was destroyed. We were being overrun in the Pacific. We were unprepared. Well, it takes more than heroism and patriotism to win a war. Every army has its heroes and every country its patriots. But as World War I demonstrated, it is production that is the key to victory. The Germans and the Japanese have been building their war machines for years. Skeptics on both sides agreed with Goering when he assured Hitler, the Americans cannot build airplanes, though they are very good at refrigerators and razor blades.
But the processes used to make refrigerators and razor blades were essentially the same as those used to build airplanes. Between 1937 and 1941, Japan congratulated itself on tripling the size of its air force from 1,500 to 4,500 planes. By 1943, American factories were producing 7,000 planes every month. When we entered the war, the Allies were in desperate need of shipping. Henry J. Kaiser, a California construction engineer who knew nothing about shipbuilding, used mass production techniques to build the Liberty ship, a 10,000-ton cargo vessel.
This model is a replica of the Liberty ship, which we built in 4.5 days, and we expect to build many more of them in a shorter time.
Although each Liberty ship had 30,000 parts, over 7,000 of them were launched during the war.
How did we produce the thousands of ships, the tens of thousands of planes, the millions of guns, and billions of shells the war required? We mobilized what greed had given us: the mines, factories, and laboratories, the technical know-how, the means of production. At the Big Three conference in Tehran, Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin offered a toast to American production, without which this war would have been lost. War had brought full employment and prosperity. And what would happen now? Would we sink back into depression? That was the fear.
Our tremendous production during the war astounded the world. It was a phenomenon which no one thought could endure after hostilities ceased. We are beginning to sense the fact, however, that our peacetime economy can not only equal our wartime economy, but can surpass it.
Surpass it indeed. The expected depression never came. America, soon followed by war-torn Europe and Japan, began the greatest economic boom in history. There was an explosion in home building. William Levitt and others put up houses the way they had army barracks during the war. Once we had homes, we filled them up with babies and new appliances. Two appliances had an impact beyond mere convenience. The air conditioner made possible the extraordinary growth of the Sun Belt by removing one of the major drawbacks to living in that region, the heat. Television replaced radio and movies as the prime medium of entertainment and news. It proved a more effective advertiser than anyone could have imagined when it was first demonstrated. In 1927, Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover sat before an early TV camera in Washington and exchanged pleasantries with an official of Bell Labs in New York. Nothing so visibly permeated the life of Americans since the automobile. Perhaps the most far-reaching outcome of the war was the development of the computer. It has so increased productivity and efficiency that its loss would cut most of our paychecks in half. The idea for this extraordinary machine goes back over 150 years. But the computer age didn't get underway until ENIAC, the first general-purpose computer, began operation in 1946. Its inventors, John W. Mauchly and J. Presper Eckert, continued their pioneering research at Remington Rand. And in 1952, UNIVAC entered commercial service. It was an instant success with banks and insurance companies because it could cope with the huge volume of paperwork that had once required mammoth storage facilities and large staffs. UNIVAC put Remington Rand in the forefront of computer and business machine technology. One company, IBM, strove to catch up. Former IBM chief Thomas Watson Jr. recalls just how big the stakes were in this undertaking.
We thought in those early days that we either had to win this one or fail as a company. And that's why I think everybody put such effort into it.
In 1954, IBM entered the field. Remington Rand failed to commit themselves to commercial computers as fully as IBM did. Eventually, IBM achieved preeminence in the industry. What made the profound advance in computer technology and general electronics possible was the transistor, one of the most significant inventions of our day. It was developed by Bell Labs for American Telephone and Telegraph in anticipation of a huge increase in demand for telephone service. Until the 1950s, the bulky, fragile vacuum tube was necessary for telephones, televisions, radios, phonographs, and computers to function. Transistors could be made at a fraction of the cost. They took up 1/200th of the space, used less energy, and were far more efficient. In addition to computers and transistors, there were numerous other technological accomplishments, so many that we've lost our capacity to be awed by them.
What had happened in America after World War II was what Henry Ford had begun 3 decades before. It was the result of combining technology with the idea behind the $5 a day wage. Contrary to the worries of many, automation and technology did not reduce the number of jobs. By keeping production costs down, technology allowed companies to pay higher wages while making more money. Americans had more money to spend and more time to spend it. This combination created new jobs and new industries.
Over 68% of the American workforce is employed in service industries. As our economy becomes more service-oriented, increases in productivity, so vital to a rising standard of living, become more difficult to achieve. It's easy to understand how new equipment can expand the output of an assembly line worker. But how do you get more productivity from a teacher, a doctor, or a waitress? The restaurant is a service industry where individual output has been traditionally low and in which it is difficult to make ends meet. One man changed that. Ray Kroc of McDonald's found a rapid, efficient way to provide low-priced food to millions and still make a good profit.
When McDonald's took the items that were one of the most appealing items in the restaurant, the hamburger, and put it on the production line, so to speak, the customers got the benefit.
Though it appears simple to us, what Kroc did was to bring mass production techniques to a service industry. Others are also employing such thinking, and as more do, Kroc's innovations may have as profound an impact on service industries as Ford's did on manufacturing.
The enormous boom of the 50s and 60s did not mean that prosperity was without problems. Economic growth has always brought change, which often produces undesirable consequences. Today, in fact, the country seems to be facing difficulties of a magnitude of those of the 30s.
Just as deflation seemed permanent in the 1930s, so inflation does today. Avaricious corporations, selfish labor unions, overbloated government, and oil-rich Arabs have all been blamed at one time or another for rising prices. But there are other, more subtle factors. Society is trying to do more than it can immediately afford. At the same time that we expect a higher standard of living in the material sense, we are demanding a substantial improvement in the quality of life. Inflation is a symptom of these shifting social concerns and the effort to fulfill them. One of the most profound and costly of these is the struggle to restore the ecological balance that our way of life has apparently endangered. More cars means a threat to our air. More chemical production, dirtier water. More pesticides, a threat to wildlife and human health. The question is, how can we get a clean environment and an economy that can provide jobs for all? This plant, engineered by Wheelabrator Fry, burns the garbage of the Boston metropolitan area, 1,200 tons a day, to provide the energy for a nearby General Electric plant that employs 12,000 people. While it is only one small step in solving our ecological problems, it does demonstrate that solutions can be found if we do not demand absolutes and are willing to pay the cost. Perhaps the greatest problem we face today is the shortage of natural resources, especially energy. While natural resources are finite, human ingenuity is virtually inexhaustible. Not long ago, there was concern about a worldwide shortage of copper, a metal we thought indispensable for telephone and power transmission. Now there has been developed a strand of glass no thicker than a human hair, which can carry 1,000 times more information than copper wire. We found substitutes for rubber and silk in the 1930s. As long as there are incentives, we will find additional sources of energy. There are many possibilities. Nuclear, geothermal, coal gas liquefaction, windmills, solar, perhaps even something as yet unimagined.
Incentive, the profit motive, what some call greed. It transformed America from the agrarian and heavy industrial society of the 19th century into the consumer society of the 20th century. It survived the Great Depression of the 30s and sustained the great boom of the 50s and 60s. It motivated men like Henry Ford, Alfred Sloan, and Ray Kroc to turn problems into opportunities for themselves and sources of prosperity for the nation. Today, as in the past, it can motivate men and women to turn the problems we face into opportunities which will be sources for tomorrow's prosperity.